story of World War I and how the history books have not told you all the details. And in that segment that we just listened to, Jerry raises a number of important points, not just about the history of World War I specifically, but about the subject of history in general. For example, who teaches the teachers of history and where do they get their knowledge? Who publishes those books that become the standard history books, and under what circumstances? What kinds of records are allowed into the historical narrative and what is excluded? Again, very foundationally important questions, and in our current day and age, I think there can be no doubt that all of the biases that inevitably sneak into any historical narrative are, at this point, institutionalized. This is an institutional system where in the academic setting, of course, there is the peer review process and the academic journals that closely gatekeep the historical record for the consensus of any given era. And there, in the general world, the education system, for example, the textbooks, of course, are published in curricula that are developed by boards that are influenced by grants from foundations and other things happening behind the scenes, the formation of cadres of teachers, the institutions like the American Historical Association. There are some very interesting roots to the system that we have today that most people in their day-to-day lives will never think about, will never encounter, but that have been important in shaping and molding their perception of history itself. That's a very profound point, so we need to do a little bit of unpacking here, and perhaps the easiest way to do that is to look at some specific examples. So let's use the World War I conspiracy as a ready-to-hand example that we can use to unpack this notion for today. And we'll start by taking a very obvious inroad into this issue. I think it should be obvious to anyone who's thinking in terms of World War I and education. Well, the World War I conspiracy, as you'll know from having watched the documentary, revolves around a clique that emerged from a secret society that turned out to not be so secret when William T. Stead blew the whistle, as it were, in 1902, but a secret society that was formed in the 1890s by Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is still a name that I think still has resonance with the general public today, not from Rhodesia, which of course is now Zimbabwe, but from the other enduring part of the Rhodes legacy that I think if you go out and ask people on the street, most people are going to associate the name Cecil Rhodes with, let's all say it together, the Rhodes Scholarship. The Rhodes Scholarship. By the time of his seventh will, Cecil Rhodes had refined his vision to enough to understand that leaving his money for a particular purpose, namely to mold and shape the perception and thinking of the next generation or generations of people, was going to require control of the education system and process itself. Now, obviously, that's a very tall order for anyone, even someone as magnificently wealthy as Cecil Rhodes. So the idea is not to try to come and outright buy the entire education system itself, whatever that would mean. But no, you select the best and the brightest minds in the upcoming generation, people who are clearly going to go on to be some of the leading academics or researchers or historians or people in particular positions of power, and mold and shape their perceptions. Get them at a young and impressionable age with the power of the pocketbook, throw money at them and say, hey guys, why don't you come over to Oxford? We'll help shape your understanding of the world. And that's exactly what Rhodes did. And of course, right away, the other robber barons and would-be social engineers of the era picked up on that idea. It was a very powerful idea. So that's why, for example, Andrew Carnegie is a name that people, again, will associate with the institutions like the public libraries that are now part of his legacy. Oh, he gave back to the public. The Rockefellers are associated with the Rockefeller Foundation and all of the philanthropic work that they do. But that philanthropic work started with their first steps in the world of education and academia. For example, as we saw in How Big Oil Conquered the World, corbettreport.com/bigoil, what was John D. Rockefeller's first steps into philanthropy? His very first step was the foundation, the endowment, and the funding for the University of Chicago. The formation of the University of Chicago. It is a Rockefeller creation. And what was one of his very next steps before the formation of the Rockefeller Foundation proper? He endowed the General Education Board with a staggering $180 million. An incredible amount of money, especially, of course, in 1905 or that era. A staggering sum of money. Almost unbelievable. Why was this Rockefeller oil monopolist business tycoon so interested in education? Well, the answer, again, should be obvious, especially to people who have seen how and why big oil conquered the world. But to spell it out a little, we did, of course, also see in that How Big Oil Conquered the World report how Rockefeller and Carnegie teamed up to produce something called the Flexner Report, which was a report that went on to standardize the medical education system as we know it today, which itself cemented into place the allopathic / big pharma system that we still associate with that idea of medicine. That is what medicine is. It is the allopathic big pharma system, which, oh, by the way, relies on big oil for a lot of the pharmaceuticals that it pimps on people. So that is a very specific example of how this functions. In the World War I case, we have another very specific example of how this functions, and this comes to us from someone who will be familiar to my long-term listeners, Norman Dodd, the head researcher for the Reese Committee, a congressional committee formed in the 1950s to examine the doings of the tax-exempt foundations, like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Ford Foundation and the other major tax-exempt foundations